All right, so you want to know about how the United States, that new nation everyone talks about, how it all got started, like how they figured out governing and all that?
Yeah, like what it even meant to be American in those early years after the Revolution, right?
Exactly. So we're diving deep today into Chapter 6, A New Nation from the American Yawp.
Great source for this kind of deep dive.
It really gets into the nitty-gritty, like Shays' Rebellion,
Oh, yeah.
ratification of the Constitution, the whole shebang.
And we can't forget those fiery debates between Hamilton and Jefferson. Those are always good.
Plus, we'll unpack, anxieties around the French Revolution. And yeah, we got to get to the Alien and Sedition Acts, but we're not just listing dates and names, right?
No way. We're going deeper.
Like, why did these things matter back then?
And what's still echoing, today.
Yeah. Okay, let's jump in. So, Shays' Rebellion, 1786. Some farmers got upset. Big deal, right?
Well, hold on. It's more than just some random uprising. Think about it. Economy's a mess after the revolution.
Right.
Farmers, a lot of them veterans, they're buried in debt,
Losing their farms.
facing foreclosures, feeling totally abandoned by the government. Under the Articles of Confederation, it just wasn't working.
Yeah, like they risked their lives for this new country and now they're losing everything.
And the government, as it stood, was basically powerless.
Hmm.
Articles of Confederation, it just didn't give them the tools to raise money or really unite the states.
More like a bunch of separate states, not really one nation.
Exactly.
So you've got Daniel Shays, Revolutionary War veteran, leads these farmers, and they decide they've had enough.
And they used tactics they knew from before the revolution.
Like blocking the courthouses so judges couldn't issue those foreclosure orders.
It's important to note, the Shayites, they genuinely believed they were carrying on that fight for liberty. Like they're patriots protecting their rights.
Right, demanding that the government actually addresses their problems.
But obviously not everyone saw it that way.
No, Governor James Bowdoin, he considered Shays and his followers a real threat.
Dangerous rebels thought they'd bring anarchy. So he sends a militia, led by Benjamin Lincoln, another veteran, to put down the rebellion.
Over 1,000 Shayites arrested. Wow.
It really shows you just how divided things were.
Yeah, former comrades now fighting against each other. Crazy. Shows how uncertain everything was.
Right. And it really laid bare the flaws of those Articles of Confederation. Leaders like James Madison, they saw this as a huge wake-up call.
They're realizing we need a stronger central government if this whole experiment is going to survive.
100%.
So Shays' Rebellion shakes things up, leads to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. We all picture those guys in wigs debating in Philadelphia, right? They just toss out the articles and go with the Constitution? Just like that?
Not quite that simple, but you're on the right track.
Mm-hmm.
Officially, it was about revising the Articles.
Okay.
12 states sent delegates. Rhode Island, of course, skipped it.
Always the independent one. But here's the interesting part. One delegate, James Madison, he comes in with a whole new idea.
Right, he'd been researching different types of government here and in Europe, and he wasn't interested in just tweaking things.
He wanted a whole new constitution, the Virginia Plan.
That was a big swing for the time. I mean, a strong federal government split into 3 branches, legislative, executive, judicial, each with power over national issues.
That's a huge leap from the idea that states should hold most of the power. Like, this is the foundation for the government we have now, with all its checks and balances.
It is.
Incredible. But I bet there are some arguments along the way, right?
Of course, lots of heated debates, especially about representation in Congress.
Right.
Big states like Virginia wanted representation based on population, makes sense, but the smaller states.
They're worried about getting drowned out.
Exactly.
That tension between big states and small states seems like it's built into the American system.
A theme that definitely keeps coming back. And then there's the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
How do you count slaves for representation?
Yeah, the 3/5 compromise.
Yeah, not a great solution. More power to slaveholding states and a dark reminder of the moral compromises made at the very beginning.
It's a tough pill to swallow that this path to a more perfect union involved some really imperfect choices.
Absolutely. A legacy that we're still dealing with today.
Okay, so they get this constitution hammered out, but then it needs ratification. I'm guessing that wasn't a walk in the park.
Not even close. It was a battle royale, no guarantee those states would agree to this new system. And this is where the anti-federalists come in.
Right.
They weren't just against change. They were genuinely worried about this powerful new government potentially crushing individual liberties.
Especially with no Bill of Rights, right?
A big concern. They thought without those clear protections for basic freedoms, tyranny was a real possibility. An argument that's still relevant today, when we talk about security versus liberty.
Absolutely.
The Federalists, the ones pushing for ratification, didn't think a Bill of Rights was necessary at first. They thought it was redundant, even dangerous.
Oh.
They worried that listing specific rights would imply that others didn't exist.
Oh, I see.
But they eventually realized to get this Constitution passed, they needed to compromise.
So the Bill of Rights, something we see as so basic to American freedom, actually came out of political wrangling.
It did. A big win for those who believed in explicitly defining and protecting individual liberties.
But I'm guessing the Bill of Rights didn't exactly cover everyone equally.
You're right. It didn't give women the right to vote or offer any special protections. And of course, the big omission was the whole issue of slavery. It was still there, still protected.
So how did they even talk about slavery at the Constitutional Convention? Did anyone stand up and say, hey, this whole owning people thing is just wrong?
Well, there were moral objections, especially from some northern delegates. But you've got these powerful economic and political interests, especially in the South. They weren't budging.
Yeah, the whole point was to create a unified nation.
Right, and that meant compromise, even if it was morally questionable.
It's hard to imagine trying to balance those ideals of liberty and equality with the reality of slavery.
A paradox that haunted the nation from the start. And the compromise they came up with, often called the dirty compromise, basically just delayed the inevitable.
Dirty compromise. That doesn't sound good.
It wasn't. The North agreed to protect the slave trade for another 20 years. In exchange, the South agreed to make it easier for Congress to pass laws about trade.
So politics and money won out over basic human decency. They basically hoped the slavery problem would just go away on its own.
Yeah, pretty much. And that decision had huge, terrible consequences for generations.
But eventually, there was a ban on the transatlantic slave trade in 1808. What led to that?
A few things came together. Britain had already outlawed the slave trade in 1807, and even with all its problems, the U.S. didn't want to look worse morally on the world stage.
So a bit of international pressure helped.
Definitely. But there were internal pressures, too. The Haitian Revolution, that successful slave revolt against France, that terrified white Americans.
They didn't want that happening here.
Exactly. So for some, ending the slave trade seemed like a way to prevent that kind of uprising.
So fear was a motivator, too. It's rarely just pure altruism that drives progress.
That's a good point. It often takes a mix of moral arguments, self-interest, and sometimes, fear to get real change.
But even with the ban, slavery itself continued. And the way they handled the ban wasn't exactly smooth.
Oh, no. Enforcement was weak, and it was up to individual states to decide what happened to illegally imported Africans. A lot of them were just sold at auction, and the ban didn't challenge the idea that people could be owned as property.
So a step towards ending the slave trade, but the institution of slavery itself was still firmly in place. A stark reminder of those moral compromises at the nation's very foundation.
Absolutely, a legacy that we're still wrestling with.
Now you've got this new nation, it's time to figure out how to actually govern. And here come these two giants, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Brilliant minds, but totally different visions for America. What were their core beliefs?
Well, Hamilton, a staunch Federalist, he believed in a strong central government. He saw America's future in industry, commerce, cities, factories, global trade.
Sounds like a Wall Street guy.
He probably would fit right in.
Yeah.
Jefferson, on the other hand, Democratic Republican, he pictured a nation of independent farmers.
Okay.
Decentralized government, limited powers, deeply suspicious of concentrated wealth and city life.
Two different worlds, really. It's interesting how their personal backgrounds shaped their political views.
For sure. And those contrasting views played out in Washington's administration, remember. They both served in the cabinet. Hamilton as Treasury Secretary, Jefferson as Secretary of State.
Head to head all the time.
You could say that. One of their biggest clashes was over Hamilton's financial plan, designed to make the federal government stronger and boost the economy.
Break it down for us. What was he proposing?
First, he wanted the federal government to take on all the debts the states had racked up during the Revolution.
Makes sense. A unified national debt. Why was that controversial?
It was seen as rewarding speculators who bought up those debts for cheap.
Okay.
And southern states, who'd already paid most of their debts, didn't like having to chip in for northern debts.
Ah, that north-south tension again. Economics and geography, they really shaped those political rivalries.
That's true. But Hamilton argued that assuming state debts was crucial for the nation's credit.
Showing the world they were good for it.
Exactly. He was thinking long-term, securing a stable financial future for the U.S.
Smart.
And that brings us to the second part of his plan, a national bank, the Bank of the United States.
Oh, yeah, that caused a stir.
Big time. Jefferson and his allies hated it. Unconstitutional, they said, and it'd give too much power to the federal government and a wealthy elite.
So it wasn't just economics, it was about who holds the power.
And who benefits from it? Those are questions we're still asking today.
Absolutely. So did Hamilton win on the bank?
He did. The Bank of the United States was chartered in 1791. Big win for the Federalists.
Their vision of a strong central government active in the economy. But not everyone was happy about it. What about those who opposed Hamilton's policies? Did they just grumble quietly?
Sometimes.
Yeah.
But sometimes that opposition went beyond just words.
Oh. You mean they fought back? Tell me more.
Remember that excise tax on whiskey that Hamilton pushed for?
The one that really hit Western farmers hard since they relied on distilling grain?
That's the one. In Western Pennsylvania, the resentment towards that tax boiled over.
They saw it as unfair, an attack on their way of life.
Right, those Eastern elites imposing their will on the frontier. So they organized protests, intimidated tax collectors, things escalated.
And they used tactics they knew from the Revolution, right?
Exactly. Tarring and feathering, burning houses, robbing the mail. They even put up liberty poles, a powerful symbol.
Wow, it sounds like they felt they were fighting for their liberty all over again.
They did, and this is where we get the Whiskey Rebellion.
The Whiskey Rebellion. One of those things you hear about, but most people don't really understand.
It's a big moment. President Washington, he saw the danger of mob rule. He was determined to crush this rebellion.
And he didn't just send troops, he led the militia himself, right? 13,000 men to Western Pennsylvania, the only president to ever lead troops in the field.
You got it. Bold move. Faced with that, the rebellion fizzled pretty quickly. Washington made examples of a few, but most were pardoned.
It was short-lived, but what was its lasting impact?
It was a test of the federal government's power.
Showed they could enforce their laws, even against armed resistance.
Right. A clear message. This new nation wouldn't tolerate violent defiance. Big contrast to how the government couldn't handle Shays' rebellion under the Articles of Confederation.
A complete 180.
The Whiskey Rebellion really cemented the power of the federal government.
But I'm guessing it also increased resentment in the West. Like, they felt ignored, misunderstood by the government and those Eastern elites.
Absolutely. It exposed those deep divisions. And those divisions would play out as the nation figured out its place in the world.
Okay, so speaking of the world stage, did the new nation manage to stay out of all the drama happening in Europe?
They tried. Washington had issued the Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793, hoping to avoid getting dragged into the war between Britain and France. But staying completely isolated, impossible.
This is where Jay's Treaty comes in.
Bingo. Now remember, the relationship with Britain was still pretty tense after the Revolution.
British troops still in those forts, tensions over trade, the impressment of American sailors.
Right, the British Navy grabbing American sailors and forcing them into service. It's hard to imagine being neutral when all that's going on.
So how did they even approach that situation?
It was complicated. Different groups had different ideas. Hamilton and the Federalists, they thought a good relationship with Britain was crucial for the U.S.
Trade and stability.
Yep. So John Jay, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, was sent to London to negotiate a treaty.
Did that go over well?
Not at all. Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans were furious. They saw it as a betrayal of the French, America's ally in the Revolution. And they were worried the treaty would favor northern businesses over southern farmers.
Again, every issue seemed to go back to that North-South divide, those different visions for America.
You're seeing a pattern here? It runs through this whole period.
Okay, so what did Jay's Treaty actually say?
There were some positives. British agreed to leave those forts in the Northwest Territory, compensate American merchants for some losses.
Right.
But Jay failed to get them to stop impressment, a huge disappointment for a lot of Americans.
Especially for those sailors being taken from their families?
It was a major sticking point. And the reaction to the treaty totally split along party lines.
Of course.
Federalists loved it, a diplomatic victory. Republicans hated it, selling out to the British.
It feels like this treaty really poured fuel on those partisan divisions.
It did, turned those loose factions into real political parties. And those battles would only get worse when news of the French Revolution reached America.
The French Revolution, not just some far-off European event, right?
Nope. It had a huge impact on American politics and society.
Forced them to really think about liberty, democracy, revolution, what those things actually meant.
It wasn't just about being for or against the French Revolution. It sparked this deep debate.
So it was like a mirror, reflecting America's own hopes and fears about its future.
Exactly. And those hopes and fears were really intertwined. At first, a lot of Americans were excited about the French Revolution.
They saw it as connected to their own fight for independence.
Right, like the spirit of '76 was spreading. A lot of those French soldiers who fought with the Americans had gone back home with ideas about republicanism and all that.
So when the French people rose up, it must have felt like their own revolution had inspired it.
And there was a lot of solidarity with the French. Imagine the celebrations, parades, toasts to liberty, the whole 9 yards. It must have been exciting.
But then the French Revolution took a turn, didn't it?
Things got complicated. The Reign of Terror, that period of violence and chaos, it sent shockwaves through America.
Yeah, revolution can turn ugly, even when it's for freedom.
Exactly. And that was especially unsettling for the Federalists, who were already nervous about too much democracy.
They didn't want another mob rule situation.
Right. They saw France as a warning. They started looking at Britain, with its monarchy and strong government, as a kind of protection against radicalism.
So it pushed the Federalists and Democratic Republicans even further apart.
Exactly. And then came Citizen Edmond Charles Genet, the new French ambassador, a real firecracker.
Citizen Genet, he was a bit of a wild card, wasn't he?
That's putting it mildly. Arrived to a hero's welcome, then immediately overstepped, tried to drag the U.S. into the war on France's side.
He was pushing it.
He even threatened to go over President Washington's head, appeal directly to the American people.
Not the best move, diplomatically speaking.
Major blunder. Washington was furious, demanded Genet be recalled. But Genet, smart guy, realized going back to France might mean losing his head. So he stayed put.
So you've got political tension, a rogue ambassador, and a war between Britain and France threatening to pull America in.
Talk about a powder keg. And right in the middle of this, the Federalists, led by President Adams, they make a drastic move.
They passed the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Yep. The Alien Act let the government deport any foreigner they considered dangerous, no evidence needed.
Harsh.
And the Sedition Act, that made it a crime to publish anything false, scandalous, and malicious about the government.
So basically, you can't criticize the government. What were they thinking? That's a direct attack on the First Amendment.
It was a blatant attempt to shut down dissent, aimed at silencing critics of Adams and the Federalists.
So how did people react?
They were outraged, especially the Democratic Republicans. They saw it as tyranny, a violation of basic rights.
Jefferson and Madison, they wrote those resolutions, right?
The Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, yep, argued that the Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional.
And that states could nullify federal laws if they overstepped their bounds.
Bold claim. Didn't actually nullify the acts, but laid the groundwork for future arguments about states' rights.
And rallied people against the Federalists. So the Alien and Sedition Acts, they kind of backfired.
Big time. They tried to silence critics, ended up making things worse.
They created martyrs, right, and accidentally sparked a movement for a broader vision of free speech.
That's right. You see, up until then, free speech meant the government couldn't censor you beforehand.
Okay.
But they could punish you after you said something they didn't like.
So speak your mind, but be ready for the consequences.
Right. But after the Alien and Sedition Acts, people started arguing for stronger protections, even for controversial speech.
Like, if you can't criticize the government, what's the point of a republic?
Exactly. They saw free speech as essential for holding leaders accountable.
It's amazing how these struggles from so long ago still shape how we understand our rights today. The Alien and Sedition Acts might have failed, but they led to a much deeper understanding of free speech.
It shows the power of ideas, that constant struggle to define liberty in a democracy. And speaking of defining liberty, there's another area we need to explore. Religion.
Ah, yeah, the whole separation of church and state thing.
Right. People think that was always there, clear-cut. But in reality, most of the original states either had official churches or you had to be a certain religion to hold office.
So no wall of separation yet.
Not like we think of it now. But over the next few decades, things started to change.
Disestablishment, right?
Yes. States gradually stopped supporting official churches, removed those religious requirements for holding office.
So how did that happen? Was there a big court case?
Not really. It happened state by state, driven by changing demographics, those Enlightenment ideas, and a growing belief that religious freedom needed separation from the government.
So a gradual change, not a sudden shift.
Exactly. Shows how progress isn't always neat and tidy.
Yeah.
Different parts of the country moved at different speeds.
Trying to balance religious freedom with public order, not always easy.
It wasn't. And their struggles laid the groundwork for the relationship between religion and government that we still see today. That's a whole other can of worms.
We've covered so much already. Rebellions, constitutions, political fights, the French Revolution, the Alien and Sedition Acts. It's amazing how much happened.
It is. And it all shaped the nation we live in today. History isn't just names and dates. It's about ideas, struggles, wins, and losses that still resonate.
It's clear that these early years were all about figuring things out. What does it mean to be a nation? What about liberty? What about equality?
They were experimenting, debating, making it up as they went along. And those debates are still with us today.
We're still trying to figure out what it means to be American, to live up to those ideals.
You got it. And that's why understanding this history is so important.
To see the connections between then and now?
It's exactly. The fight for a more perfect union, it's ongoing. So last time we were talking about the U.S. dealing with internal tensions and that whole French Revolution situation.
Yeah, that wasn't just some European thing happening over there, was it? It really hit a nerve back in America.
It did. It made Americans think hard about liberty, democracy, and what happens when revolutions go too far. It wasn't just a simple, are you for it or against it kind of thing.
More like it forced them to really look at their own ideals.
Exactly. It was a mirror reflecting their own hopes and their fears, too, about what America was going to become.
And those hopes and fears were all tangled up together.
Oh, absolutely. At first, a lot of Americans were super excited about the French Revolution.
They saw it as part of their own fight for freedom, right?
Right, like the spirit of '76 was spreading across the world, and a lot of those French soldiers who'd fought with the Americans, they'd gone back home with all these ideas about republics and the people having the power.
So when the French people revolted, it was almost like their own revolution had inspired it.
Exactly. There's a real sense of connection there.
I can picture it. Celebrations in the streets, speeches, people toasting to the French Republic.
It must have been heady stuff. But then the French Revolution, well, it got messy.
Yeah, things got kind of out of control, the reign of terror.
That's right. All that violence and chaos, it really scared people in America, especially the Federalists, who were already kind of nervous about too much democracy.
They didn't want a repeat of mob rule.
Right. They saw what was happening in France, and it was like a big warning sign. And they started to see Britain, even with its king, as a way to protect themselves from that radicalism.
So it pushed the two sides even further apart, didn't it? The Federalists and the Democratic Republicans.
It did. And then you have citizen Edmond Charles Genet arriving on the scene, the new French ambassador. He was a piece of work.
Citizen Genet, wasn't he the guy who didn't quite understand how American politics worked?
That's one way to put it. He was supposed to be a diplomat, but he tried to drag America into the war on France's side, even threatened to bypass Washington completely and appeal directly to the people.
That's a bold strategy. Not sure how well that would have gone over.
It didn't. Washington was not happy, demanded Genet be recalled to France, but Genet was no dummy, realized going back might get him executed. So he stayed put in America.
Can't blame him for that. So now you've got all this tension, a rogue ambassador, and this war looming that could pull America in. Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It was a volatile time, that's for sure. And in the middle of all this, the Federalists, with President Adams in charge, they do something pretty drastic. Pass a set of laws meant to silence their critics and target foreigners.
The Alien and Sedition Acts.
You got it, the Alien Act. That let the government deport any foreigner they thought was dangerous, didn't even need evidence.
That's pretty scary. And then the Sedition Act made it a crime to criticize the government, basically.
Basically, yeah. Couldn't publish anything false, scandalous, or malicious about the government. A direct attack on the First Amendment, a way to control what people could say.
They were trying to silence anyone who disagreed with them. What was the reaction to that?
Oh, people were furious, especially the Democratic Republicans. They saw it as tyranny, pure and simple.
I remember learning about those Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. That was Jefferson and Madison.
Yeah, that's right. They argued that those acts were unconstitutional, said states had the right to ignore federal laws if they went too far, didn't actually get those acts overturned, but it set the stage for a lot of arguments about states' rights later on.
And got people fired up against the Federalists, so it backfired, right? Trying to shut people up just made them angrier.
It definitely did. They created martyrs and accidentally sparked a movement for even stronger free speech protections. See, up until then, free speech meant the government couldn't censor you before you said something, but they could still come after you for what you said.
So freedom of speech, but with limits.
Exactly. But the Alien and Sedition Acts made people realize that wasn't enough. They started arguing that even controversial speech should be protected.
Makes sense. If you can't criticize the government, then what's the point of having a republic?
That's the idea. Free speech means you can hold those in power accountable. It's amazing how much these struggles from way back then still matter today. Those acts might have been a failure, but they led to a deeper understanding of what free speech really means. It shows that progress doesn't always go in a straight line. Sometimes you need that pushback against injustice to clarify things.
So while all this political drama is unfolding, there's another big development, the election of 1800. And this wasn't just any election, was it?
Nope, this was a big one. The first peaceful transfer of power from one party to another.
And I bet the political climate was super tense back then.
Oh, you bet. Both sides thought the fate of the country was at stake. The Federalists. They were saying a Jefferson win would mean anarchy, like what happened in France.
So they used the French Revolution as a scare tactic, basically.
Exactly. Jefferson, he's a dangerous radical, he'll ruin everything. That's what they were saying.
And what was Jefferson's side saying?
They accused the Federalists of wanting to set up a monarchy, said they were destroying democracy. Adams was a power-hungry tyrant trying to undo the revolution, according to them.
Sounds like things got pretty nasty.
It did. A lot of personal attacks, fear-mongering, the whole 9 yards. And then it all comes down to the Electoral College. And wouldn't you know it, Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr, they tie. 73 electoral votes each. It goes to the House of Representatives to decide.
They tied. That's crazy. How'd they break the tie?
Well, the Federalists still had a majority in the House. They could have chosen Burr, even though he was supposed to be the vice president.
So they could have held on to power, even though they'd lost the election.
They could have. But after 36 ballots, Hamilton ended up backing Jefferson, and Jefferson won.
Must have been a stressful few weeks waiting to see who'd be president.
It was. But the fact that the Federalists accepted the results and let their rivals take power, that was huge. Showed the strength of American democracy, even when things were super divided.
So the election of 1800 was a real test. Could this young nation actually handle a peaceful transfer of power?
And it passed. Set a really important precedent.
But even though they lost the presidency, the Federalists still had some power, right? The Supreme Court.
Ah, yes, John Marshall. Adams appointed him Chief Justice right before leaving office.
Marshall was a Federalist too, wasn't he? And a brilliant legal mind.
He was. Believed in a strong national government, a broad interpretation of the Constitution. He was on the court for 34 years. His rulings really shaped American law.
Wasn't he the one who established judicial review with Marbury v. Madison?
That's right. On the surface, that case was about some undelivered paperwork for these minor judges. But Marshall used it to say that the Supreme Court could declare laws unconstitutional.
So they could overturn what Congress had passed. That's a big deal.
Huge. It completely changed the balance of power between the branches of government.
Wow. One court case can really make a difference.
It's true. Marbury v. Madison, that's a cornerstone of American law ever since. We've talked about rebellions, the Constitution, political battles, the French Revolution, the Alien and Sedition Acts, the election of 1800, Marbury v. Madison. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. And it's clear that these early years of the U.S. were all about figuring things out, experimenting. What's the role of government? What does liberty really mean? What about equality? So many big questions.
And we're still grappling with those questions today, aren't we?
Absolutely. It's like we're still trying to define what it means to be an American, to live up to those ideals from the founding.
And that's why understanding this history is so crucial. It helps us see how we got here. The fight for a more perfect union, it's something that never really ends.
Welcome back for the final part of our deep dive. We've been through a lot. Rebellions, constitutions, political showdowns, the French Revolution, even religious freedom in the new nation. It's been quite a ride.
It has. We've seen the U.S. grappling with all these huge questions about how to govern, what liberty means, how to define equality. And it's amazing how much happened in such a short time and how much of it still affects us today.
Yeah, it's like we're still living with the echoes of those debates, federal power versus states' rights, individual freedom versus keeping things stable, and the role of religion, that's a whole other thing.
For sure. And what really strikes me is how much of this era was about uncertainty, trying things out. They'd won independence, but they didn't have a roadmap for what came next.
They were building a whole new government from scratch, and they didn't always agree on how to do it.
Exactly. And it's pretty remarkable that they were able to create a system that's lasted this long, even with all its imperfections.
We've talked about those imperfections, the hypocrisy of talking about liberty while allowing slavery, leaving women out of the political process. It's hard to square those things with how we think about the Founding Fathers.
It is. And it's important that we don't ignore those hard truths. But we also have to remember they were living at a very different time. Those 18th century ideas shaped how they saw the world.
It's tough to judge people from the past by today's standards.
It can be. But we can't forget that their decisions still affect us. The legacy of slavery and inequality, the debates about the balance of power, what it means to be free, those are still issues today.
So how do we reconcile those two things? Admiring what they accomplished, but also seeing their flaws, recognizing the incredible system they created, but also acknowledging the injustice that was built into it.
That's a tough question. No easy answers. But maybe that's the point. To look at history not as heroes and villains, but as this complicated mix of ideas, struggles, successes, and failures. To see the founders as people, flawed people, trying to deal with incredibly hard problems.
Here we're like holding up a mirror to human nature itself, with all its messiness, and that's something we can learn from.
Definitely. And one big takeaway from this era, I think, is that democracy is an ongoing thing. It's not about reaching some perfect endpoint. It's a constant process, working things out between different groups, different values, and finding ways to live together even when we disagree.
It's like that saying, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. Every generation has to figure it out for themselves, fight for it, redefine it.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is how those early debates are still playing out today. The arguments about the role of government, how much individual freedom we should have, what equality really means. We're still having those conversations.
It's like we're still trying to figure out what it means to be American, to live up to those ideals they laid out.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so vital to understand this history, to see how it connects to our present, and to realize that building a more perfect union is a never-ending job.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, is there anything you'd encourage our listeners to explore further? A particular event, a person, a source that really stood out to you?
I think it'd be really interesting to learn more about those who oppose the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists.
They don't get as much attention as the big names like Hamilton and Madison.
They don't. But their concerns about power, liberty, and the dangers of tyranny are incredibly relevant today.
That's a great point. They offer a different perspective on the founding, help us see how complicated it really was. So listeners, if you're interested in learning more, check out Patrick Henry, George Mason, Mercy Otis Warren. You might be surprised at how much their words resonate with what's happening today.
And don't forget about those primary sources. The American Yawp has a ton of letters, speeches, pamphlets from that time. It's like getting a direct window into how they thought back then.
It's almost like hearing their voices across time.
Exactly. It reminds us that history isn't some dead thing. It's alive. It's relevant. It's full of insights that can help us understand our own world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So that's it for this deep dive. Keep those minds curious, keep exploring the past, and remember, the story of America is still unfolding. We all have a part in writing the next chapter.